morning, everyone, or afternoon, I guess at this point. Thank you so much for being here with us today for this really important discussion on this important topic. We've already gotten a ton of questions through the registration form, so we're hoping to discuss all your questions and any other questions that come up in the last 10 or 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A button. Lenore, could you share the PowerPoints?
Right, can everybody see it? Okay.
Thanks. All right, next slide. So our goals for this hour are to inspire synagogues to rethink about how space can be used, including to diversify your income. Also think about how your property and buildings might be repurposed to provide services for your congregation and or the wider community, and plan to create a lasting legacy. And finally, we'll offer some resources to help you think through these options. Next slide, please. The presentation will have roughly 4 sections, like I said, with Q&A at the end. We'll be looking at why think about these topics now. You probably have a good idea about that since you're here with us. How to plan, knowing your options, and some next steps and resources for you. Next slide. Thanks. So joining me here today are Karen Kolodny, who has worked in the nonprofit sector for 25 years and has been a lay leader for even longer. Karen's most recent full-time position was as the CEO of JCC of Mid-Westchester in Scarsdale, New York. Previous to that, she was in-house counsel and director of media and technology at the 92nd Street Y, a $50 million New York City icon for cultural activities. Karen has a deep interest in helping nonprofit organizations find the highest and best use of their real estate and has been consulting organizations on this topic. I'm also joined by Amy Schwach, who has been the executive director at Temple Sherei Tafila since 2015. She has worked for 25 years with Jewish communities and has worked at the Central Synagogue in New York City and North Shore Synagogue in Syosset, New York, respectively. Amy participated in UJA's Mulstein Institute for Jewish Professional Leadership, as well as UJA's Jewish Greening Fellowship. Next slide. I am the executive director of Bricks and Mortals. And just really briefly about who we are, if you haven't been with us before, we are a nonprofit multi-faith membership organization, and our members directly elect our board. And our membership includes both faith-based community and also the real estate community. We're focused on New York City, but we also work nationally, and we never charge for our services. Next slide. Our core purpose as Bricks and Mortals is to ensure that faith-based organizations like all of you have the knowledge, connections, access to resources, and advocacy they need to manage their real property in service of their mission and communities, understand and address new realities that affect faith communities and their real estates, build resilience, and take charge of their own destinies and legacies. So this is why we've organized this conversation today. And at this point, I'll pass it to Amy, who will discuss why we should all be thinking about these questions and opportunities right now.
Thank you, Kate. So why now? Many synagogue buildings have great historical and cultural significance, as many of you know. Our facilities are facing challenges, diminishing attendance and resources, and increasing maintenance and building costs. Next slide, please. The average urban sacred site, as you can see, generates about $1.7 million in economic impact annually. There's a few statistics about who these faith-based organizations serve. 58% of emergency shelter beds in 11 cities come from 58% of emergency, 58% of emergency shelter beds come from faith-based organizations. There's so many services that are organizations offer across the country, 40% of vital human services in cities. And our buildings are important community gathering spaces and social service providers. So there are so many different things that our buildings are offering. And we need to be able to monetize some of those things so we can keep doing it. Next slide, please. As we also all know, which is why you're all here, is our attendance is down generally. We have declining affiliation. And the COVID-19 pandemic really affected many of our institutions. And I'll speak from my own. We lost 200 families in our congregation who left New York City, the Upper East Side. Many of our younger families who moved to the Midwest or down south to be with family and didn't come back. And so that was a very meaningful impact to our congregation, and we're trying to build that back. Next slide. What does it all mean? 100,000 properties are expected to be sold or repurposed by 2030, billions of dollars in faith-owned property, 75 to 150 congregations per week closed between 2010 and 2020 in the US. That is huge, huge number. Many of us know somebody who's been involved in a merger or closed, or know somebody or who have managed those closures or congregations who've merged. Unsustainable costs. Church property costs $7 to $10 per square foot annually to operate. I mean, if you know your building, and I see many people who are executive directors on this call, my colleagues, to run this building alone, we have to take out from our restricted funds and hundreds of thousands of dollars every year just to maintain our systems that are 60 or 70 years old. Not even to think about purchasing new systems. We're trying to update them to keep them manageable. Next slide. Context of New York City, which I know that many people on this call are not in, but we will use this as an example. For scale, 5,600 religious properties in New York City, 92 million square feet of land, 2.5 times the size of Central Park, just for reference. That's a very good reference, Kate. 86 million square feet of available FAR would yield approximately 98,000 homes. That is huge. That's a great statistic. Membership income is decreasing, as we talked about. The cost to maintain property is rising in New York and is very expensive. And as many of you know, we can't move out this way, we move vertical. So you'll hear a little bit later about air rights and how congregations can try to monetize their space, not by moving outward, but by moving upward. And often we're dealing with landmark buildings, which, as many of you also know, is almost impossible then to make changes or to use as rental property without getting specific permission. Next slide. Planning, what, why, and how. Next slide. So here's what I will tell you, having been in a merger in my congregation in Long Island. Put yourself in the driver's seat as the administrator or the person helping to manage the process. Keep calm and stay in control. Everything will work itself out, but there will be a lot of details that you have to manage. Next slide. Now is the time to plan. Don't be on procrastination avenue. Make sure you're on planning drive. Next slide. Timing is everything. Don't wait too long to start planning your future and your legacy. Determine a plan, a commitment to implement the plan, and find the right people. In this presentation, we'll give you access to resources to help you do just that. Clearly set out action steps to find outcome and metrics, and expect a long timeline. I think I'm turning it over now to Karen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Kolodny. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone. We're going to repeat over and over again how important it is to plan and to know your options. The fact that you're on this call says you already know that this is an issue. It's a process, and it's a process to think through your real estate as an asset for your congregation instead of just it's the building and now I'm going to look at membership and clergy. Your building is an important part of your conversation, and you need to ask some difficult questions about that real estate. Is the ceiling so big and beautiful that people feel dwarfed? Are you spending more to keep the building up when there are fewer people in the building? I mean, all the questions that you're probably asking yourselves. So as Amy just said, now is a time to plan. Create a task force. People don't like to be on committees, then call it a task force. And go through all the different questions that you should be asking about your real estate, whether it's should we rent it, should we sell it, should we merge, or should we reinvest in it? Lots of questions that you need to ask, and you need to ask those in the context of what are your membership trends? If this year's Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services were lower attended than you had anticipated, or if your if your Kol Nidre pledges were not as you had expected, that could be a trend. Think about that, project that out, do lots and lots of financial modeling. What if we get more of this? What if we get fewer of this? It's the kind of modeling that your treasurer could do, a member of your community could do. There are resources out there to help you do that. Okay, next slide, please. So before we talk more about the tachlis, or the real questions about the real estate, we need to understand that synagogues are emotional space, and it's not just a building. To many people, it's where their grandfather first went when he came to America, or it's where children were named, or where people were married. So, and people have a connection to that space. It's a special space for them. Also, your synagogue may not be focused on the building. Think about whether or not you're your program concentric, congregant centric, or clergy or community centric. Because if you're any of those, then your building is not as important. And those are tough questions to ask. Do people come because of where it's located, or do they really come because of something else? Again, difficult questions to ask, but part of the process, not just financial questions, but emotional ones. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to talk about your various options. This is like a 5-minute presentation. This could be an entire course. Go through it quickly. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And you'll get the slides afterwards. And so you'll have, and there's great resources that Kate and her team put together at the end. So the first thing you need to do is look at your existing space. Analyze what, and room by room, analyze what's being used when. Do we use this room very often? How often? When? What time of day? Can we move something? Can we move something instead of doing it at 3 o'clock? Can we do it at 1 o'clock and therefore rent that room to someone else? And what many synagogues do during this process is they come up with what's called a property mission statement. And the property mission statement says, this is what we believe the property should be doing for us. It may mean you're accessing it to the community. It may mean you're opening your kitchen as a soup kitchen. It may mean that you want to have a specific type of tenant come in when you're looking for tenants. Create a mission statement for your property will help you understand how to use your current space with your future goals in mind. Next slide, please. So this was created by Goldstein Hall, which is a law firm that really specializes in this area. And if you look at the intersection between license and envision, that is the simplest place to start. That license in this case means letting somebody use your space, but not exclusively. So I'm going to give the example of the Boy Scouts. You're letting the Boy Scouts come into your building every Wednesday afternoon. They can use one of the rooms. Great. That's great. All the way to the top is if you decide to sell your building to the Boy Scouts. So you started off with a license using the room at some times during the day. A lease gives them control over that whole room all the time. And a sale is if you sell it to them. On the bottom axis, you could see that you're starting with envisioning and reimagining. So we're envisioning and reimagining more tenants in our building. In order to do that, we have to renovate, we may have to repurpose, and then we may end up developing or selling, in this case, to the Boy Scouts. You want to start at the intersection. You want to start with simple licensing of your space. You don't want to necessarily start, or you may, But if you're new at this, you may just want to start with, how do we get more people in our building to use the space that's not being used before you go all the way to sale? On the other hand, you may be done with your building and you may say, I'm not looking for the Boy Scouts on Wednesdays. I absolutely got to sell the building. Your risk increases as you go further up on these arrows. That's the point of this. You have to figure out your risk analysis to figure out where you want to go on these X and Y axes. Next slide, please. Space sharing. That's probably the easiest one to start with. You get some extra revenue and you rent some space. My example is the Boy Scouts. It could be anything you want. It could be simple, as in driver's ed gets a room on Wednesday, Boy Scouts get it on Thursday, BBYO gets it on Tuesday, or it could be a full lease of your building. The next slide, please, gives you an example of a more elongated lease. The SAJ is a synagogue on the Upper West Side of New York. They had extra space. They went to Denham Wolf, which is a company that I think there's somebody on this call that focuses on real estate in the nonprofit sector, and they figured out what they wanted, and they found a long-term rental for a church that was under renovation. So that was further up the axis. That wasn't just a license, that was a lease. And these leases take time to negotiate. There are a lot of details that are involved. If you're renting to a church, what about the cross? What about the iconography of a synagogue or a church? Lots of questions to ask. There are resources out there. Denham Wolf is one of them. So that just shows you how sharing space could either be as simple as one room after school, or a whole school. And many schools are looking at using synagogue and church space now because there's classroom space. Next slide, please. So if you're thinking of renting to or from another nonprofit, not just to the Boy Scouts after school, but to a rental, similar to what we just discussed with SAJ, you need to think through a whole bunch of issues. And this is just the beginning of a checklist. Are you allowed to rent? Do your bylaws allow you to rent? Security is a big issue. Who's going to pay for security? Who's paying for extra security if that tenant wants to stay longer during the day? Is there going to be signage that says St. John Episcopal Church to the left, Temple Israel to the right? You got to think about these things. Co-programming has its pros and cons. The pro is you're building a relationship with this other congregation. Maybe you don't want to. Maybe all of your values don't align, and so you don't really want to do co-programming with them. You want to have separate programming. Another really practical issue is just storage. Where are you going to keep everything? This is just some of the things to think about as you're thinking about a long-term rental of your space. Next slide, please. So another option is to partially develop. We're moving up the axis. We're not just renting space, we're redeveloping part of it. And this is St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Queens, has used some of its space to house LGBTQ youth, and they've partnered with another organization. There was, I forget where, there's a church in the South that opened up part of its building for ropes course for kids with special needs. So there's, this was in the article in the New York Times this weekend. So you can find partial redevelopment. I tell this story often that Catholic churches are very tall. Some of them have redeveloped their space, especially in Montreal, where I'm from, for a Cirque du Soleil, because Cirque du Soleil is founded in Montreal and they needed those high spaces for acrobatics. So everything is on the table if you want to just rethink about how to repurpose your space. Next slide, please. To completely, fully redevelop your property is further along the line. This is an example of the Reformed Temple in Queens that redeveloped its space to include community facilities, rental property, affordable housing. Affordable housing is a big project. Kate at Bricks and Mortals has a whole team that talks about conversion of affordable housing spaces. There are conferences on sacred spaces moving to low-cost housing. So this is an area where you will find a lot of resources. Again, may not work in Manhattan, but may work in Texas. So that's just something to think about. Next, please. So this is just the example of the redevelopment of the synagogue. Next, please. So this may be very specific to New York or urban areas, but the idea is that you can sell your air rights. So each property is allowed to build to a certain height. Sometimes you'll see here the synagogue or the church is not building to its complete height. It can sell its unused air rights to a building next door or even down the block. And another building can use those air rights. It's a common real estate transaction in New York. It may not be in other places. It's clearly not relevant in small towns, but that's another way to raise some money out of your property. Next, please. So this is the example. Central Synagogue sold their air rights for a development that was blocks away. It wasn't right next to it, but the way cities are built with grids, they allow you to transfer those air rights to another location. And basically you're selling air and making money. You see here that they've got $20 million. Next slide, please. So if you're going to sell your building, you need to think about what you're going to do. Are you going to merge with another synagogue? Are you going to go out of business completely? If you're going to merge, who are you going to merge with? Are you merging with someone of your own denomination? That's getting complicated because denomination lines are blurring. Habonim sold their building and is now in the base of a residential building. Lincoln Square Synagogue, also on the this is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, sold its building, moved to the building 2 over, and sold not only its land, but the developer agreed to build them a synagogue in the new building. I think there were air rights involved there as well. So this had nothing to do with another synagogue. This was another way to use your building to bring in some revenue. They got a beautiful new building on they don't have a building. They have a synagogue within a building. So again, options to think about. Next, please. Okay, so here's where we roll up our sleeves and start thinking about if you're going to sell your building, what do you have to do? You first have to make sure that you own the building. And it sounds simple, but you may not. You may have inherited the building from a synagogue that was very small 50 years ago, or nobody can find the title. Make sure you have the title. Find out about zoning. You may be in the right zone. You may have to switch zoning. Do you switch the zoning or does the future buyer switch the zoning? You're going to need an appraisal in order for the so the Attorney General approval is at the end, but the Attorney General has to approve in most states the sale of a nonprofit to a sale of any nonprofit property. They're going to want an appraisal to make sure that the value of the property that you're selling is actually a fair market value. You're going to have to get the appraisal. Only certain people can do the appraisals. There's rules on those appraisals. You got to think you got to think about that. You got to think about your bylaws. Who is allowed, who has to approve the sale of the building? Is it a membership vote? Is it the board? Do you have restrictions on your mortgage? Do you have a penalty if you prepay your mortgage? Do you have an encumbrance on your building that doesn't allow you to sell it to just anybody, that it has to go to another nonprofit? Also, finally, you have to be clear about the proceeds of the sale. Proceeds of a sale have to go to another nonprofit or another public interest. You can't just sell it and put the money in your pocket. This takes lots of time. The Attorney General approval can take months, sometimes years. So all of these things have to be considered as you're thinking about your sale. Next, please. If you're just moving in with another synagogue, somebody is moving or somebody is selling, you're not merging, but you're working with another synagogue, there's a lot of details to think about. Again, branding, halacha, many of these deals have fallen apart because of the kashrut of the kitchen. That has been, in my experience, sort of the #1 issue. X doesn't want it to be kosher, Y insists that it be kosher. You want to build a separate kitchen that's not kosher, but there's not enough room. There's a lot of details to think about if you're going to share space with another synagogue, and it can work beautifully. Just have to think about these things. Next, please. If you're merging with another synagogue, that also could take months, if not a couple years, to work that through. Similar to what we said before, there's a lot of detail. I know of one deal that fell through because they wouldn't allow the photos of the past presidents on the wall. There's a lot of communication with the synagogues. It's a lot of detail and community engagement. You research, you check each other out. There's a whole process involved here, but it's just lots to think about. Next, please. Finally, just to say that there is halacha on the sale of a synagogue. Obviously in Talmudic times, there weren't the same resources we have now, but there is halacha that says you can't sell a synagogue if you're the only synagogue in a community, if there's nowhere else for people to pray. But there are exceptions. You can move to another synagogue, but as long you need to have a place for people to pray in a community. So if you're in a very small community and you're the only synagogue, there's some halacha to guide you how to proceed. Next, I think that's it for me. Yep.
So hopefully that's been really helpful so far. And in this section, we're going to talk about what everyone is hopefully waiting for, which is how do I actually do this? But look at can you turn to the next slide? Thank you. Hat tip to Goldstein Hall again for putting together this really helpful guidance document that provides a good summary on how to structure this process, really no matter what you're considering for your property and your space. And the next few slides will go into a few of these points. Next slide, please. In terms of choosing your team, it's really crucial to have a reliable partner or partners and to know exactly what you're signing up for. These points should be able to help you suss out all the specifics and help you find the partner that's right for you and for the project that you're working on. I'd encourage you to come back to this document as you're thinking about your projects and choosing folks to work with. I think there's a link included above under the title. And really, if you're looking for anyone from doing full-scale development or doing a maintenance project on your building, this should be helpful. Next slide. Communications should be part of the process as you're considering all your options and putting together your team. I also just want to highlight the last point here, which has already been raised, and I think is just very crucial, is that emotions fill all these conversations and for many parties involved. So give space for those feelings and for those conversations as you're going through the process. Think about what your space will look like, if who you're going to be sharing with, and what your future will be. Bricks and Mortals can provide you with connections to folks you might want to hire, references from the faith community, and also other faith organizations who have done a wide range of projects. Some of the ways that we connect people is through our directory, membership meetings, networking events, and conferences. As you're going through this process, some resources we offer that might be helpful to you are our weekly news update on faith properties. We do faith real estate listings, both long-term and short-term. So the multitude of ways you might be able to either rent your space or rent a different space or rent from someone. Trainings and events, and also connections to resources such as funding and other kind of knowledge. And yet, just to clarify, we will be emailing the recording of this, but also the slide deck. So as a member of Bricks and Mortals, as I said, you apply to be a member, and those members directly elect our board. So I have a lot of power and input into what this organization looks like, what kind of resources we develop, and what we're focused on. And as a member, you get even more support than everything I've just mentioned. And these are just some of the benefits. And that includes a list of a library of critical information and also an annual wellness assessment that we're developing right now that assesses congregations' financial, community, congregation, and property health, and then offers resources for each of those. These are several guidance documents from reputable, nationally recognized sources that you can refer to depending on what you're considering. So to summarize everything we've hit on it's only been a half an hour, but that's been a lot of information. Start the process now. Start thinking about this as soon as you can, because as soon as as early as you do, the more options you have available to you. Make a plan and get partners to walk with you in that journey. There are some resources in here about finding those folks to partner with. And this experience will be unique for every congregation. If your neighbor went through the same thing or your friend, it's not going to look exactly the same as it will for your congregation. But that being said, you can also take their lessons learned and also inspiration from people who have already done it. And I'd really encourage folks to reach out to other congregations to hear how the process was for them, what would have made it easier, and see the great results that they're having. And I'll say, just to put it out there, that most congregations are going through this, if not all congregations, but many are also embarrassed to have that conversation openly with others. But I just want to make it clear that almost everyone, if not everyone, is having this conversation internally right now. So the more you're able to be comfortable with talking to other congregations who are thinking about this, the more support you can get in a lot of different ways. And just remembering that engaging about your property isn't admitting a defeat on your property. Engaging it actually gives you the most options for the future. So next slide. So finally, here are just 3 upcoming events that Bricks and Mortals is holding. In case any might be helpful for you, we're actually having a membership meeting this Thursday. At our bi-monthly membership meetings, we do a case study on how property has been used and learn as I said, lessons learned, get some inspiration, talk about the nitty-gritty of that, and also offer a resource. In this case, it's the Community Security Initiative and what services they offer to faith-based organizations. We're following that up in January with an event with the Community Security Initiative, which is funded by the UJA and JCRC. And we're also having a networking event. We have tons of events, so these are just the ones that are coming up next. So now we have time for questions. Manor, if you want to unshare the screen, is there anything that came in? And we also have some questions that folks sent us, but if you have any questions as we go through this, feel free to drop them in the Q&A also.
There was a question that came in by more than one person, and I apologize, I forgot to refer to it. And that is, if you're going to rent your space, how do you calculate how much rent to charge? So if I could just answer that one quickly, Kate, because I meant to and I didn't. So each market's going to be different. You want to undercharge rather than overcharge. You'd rather make less and get the tenant in than charge too much. You need to figure out your costs. So do it from a cost analysis. I shouldn't say likely, you may have to have overtime of your cleaning staff, and you may have to have overtime of your security staff. Our experience when we were renting out our building was it needed to be cleaned after the users left, no matter how much they said they would clean up after themselves. So we had to pay overtime. So calculate what your overtime is going to be for at least security and potentially maintenance staff. Figure out a little bit of profit. You don't want to get no profit. And then do some comparables around your building. Be honest, your building is not the Ritz-Carlton conference room. So if the Ritz-Carlton is charging 100, don't think you can charge 90. The reasons we're having these conversations is often because these buildings are not in great shape or they're older. And so be modest, make some money. Don't try to gouge anybody, but don't do it at a loss because you're defeating the purpose.
Yeah,
Thank you. I just wanted to answer that.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I also just add in the one of the last pages where we have the links, there is a document that we developed with Partners for Sacred Places with guidance on how to price your space and what you should be thinking about during that. I would say, Karen hit the big points, which is figure out what your space costs to rent and make sure you're thinking about the 360 view of it. And then in terms of pricing it, in addition to that, talk to your neighbors and see what they're charging, other faith institutions, and then figure out what your costs are. But please check out that resource document, and that should be helpful with a lot of specifics.
Okay, I got a couple of questions in the Q&A. Seth Hulktower says, we've rented space in the summer to people who found us. What are some good resources to use to advertise available space, either for the summer or during the year?
Facebook Marketplace, local newspapers don't exist anymore. Bricks and mortars, get the word out through other congregations, get the word out through local community conversations. I just worked on a property, a strategic plan for sacred space, and we invited in a whole bunch of people to come and look at the space, to get a tour of it, and that prompted people to go, oh, I didn't realize this was available. So have the local city council person come in, have the Chamber of Commerce come in, have the local community college come in and get a tour of the space, and then have a one-page sheet that explains them what's available. And that was I think that was pretty successful, actually. So it was getting the word out by having the people come in and see what was available.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have a short-term space sharing website, venuely.org, where you can list your space. We're working on expanding that actually with two arts organizations in New York to get even wider reach. But another point I would just say is that many rentals, and Karen, I think alluded to this, come from within the congregation. So, and many times people in the congregation don't even know that they can rent out this space. So either you can make a quick like one pager or poster, whatever it is, or just make an announcement, either, during the worship service or by email, and let people know that, this room is available. Let us know if you want to use it. And if possible, you can include it on your website also, so that people can find it that way and reach out to you that way.
The local papers are now online. So all of the local papers we used to get are now, the online Upper East Side, patch or whatever you want to call it. And you can also put your information there, post it.
Neighborhood, is that one of the online ones? People, I think it's called Neighborhood. That's another one I've used. Goes by zip code.
So Sandy Moss said, Kate, please repeat the short-term rental website.
I will put it
Let me-
in the chat. But I'm also looking at the other questions that folks sent us also during registration. And one I think is interesting, which is the question about fundraising and bridge loans. So I don't know if Amy or Karen, you want to take the first stab at that.
Go for it.
Oh, sorry, funding and bridge loans for the local law 97 work?
No, it doesn't specify, but feel free to take it in whatever direction you desire.
Oh, we didn't do it. We didn't do it. The information that we did receive about funding and bridge loans for the local law 97 work that had to be done came a little later than we needed. So we ended up doing much of the work ourselves, and it came out of our pocket. But I understand from many of the presentations that I've been a part of that the city is offering loans, bridging loans, and a lot of aid to help houses of worship become compliant with all of the local law 97 and all of the new guidelines that have come out, that we now have to make our buildings lighter footprints.
Yeah,
I'm
I
sorry.
would also encourage folks to, rather than to take only soft money rather than the hard money from, rather from a bank that will charge you the same thing as a private company, look to a denominational funder or something like that. That will typically, or in New York, not the nonprofit finance fund. I think they fund outside New York as well, who can give you a much lower interest rate and are used to working with nonprofits.
You might also get a loan from the congregants that would be at a lower rate, or a combination of the congregant loan and, as Kate said, other loans. People like to see that you have the skin in the game. So if you're getting some donors to support you as well as going to a bank or as well as denominational funding, that might be helpful.
Right, so best practices on how to fund and maintain a building that is owned by the organization, i.e. the church or the synagogue, etc.
Sorry, best practices to,
Fund and maintain a building that is owned by the organization.
Oh, man, how many hours do you have? Yeah, I'm certainly happy to be helpful there offline. There are a number of ways to do that. We have found with our building here on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, that it's almost impossible to manage the number of things that have to be fixed and updated. It's a very old building. It was a movie theater before. It was purchased by the congregation, and so it was purchased in the late 50s. And I would tell you that I don't even know how many decades old it was that things were upgraded before that. And what I've done is, in order to manage that, we've hired a building management company that helps us make the appropriate plans to plan out several years in advance for major capital projects, the roof, boilers, things like that, and to help manage with the smaller projects and keep them in line and prioritize. It's almost impossible for me to be able to do it by myself. And I have a very limited resources for staff. But the building management company is very, very helpful, and they can offer additional staff for what we pay for their services. But I am happy to be helpful if you want to contact me offline. My email is in the presentation. I'm happy to talk you through anything you need.
Great. So the next question is opportunities for space rentals and best. Okay, we've already touched that. Advice on finding churches that need community space on a Sunday.
walk the neighborhood. Go see which churches there are, walk in, make an appointment, see if you can speak to them, ask them to come and look at your property. There's a good chance, a really good chance that that church is having the same conversation that you're having now, that they can't afford the space that they have, and they're trying to think of what to do. They've got this beautiful sanctuary, 100-year-old pipe organ, and there's 30 people in the sanctuary. It's truly about, and there are some interfaith organizations in various towns. Chamber of Commerce may help. Interfaith collaboratives around hunger may have brought people together. It's word of mouth. It's finding people who have, this goes back to the property mission. It has people that, it goes to finding people with a shared mission. And it's, one of the things that I have recommended to people is that you hire someone to do this work, or you find somebody who's committed to doing this work part-time, probably initially, to finding those partners, to creating that open house for other people. Everyone is so busy that you need to make someone's job getting more rentals in the building, and it's someone else's job, or the same person, communicating with the congregation what you're doing. This stuff doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen on itself, but I know the congregation churches are dealing with the same situation. 1,000 churches are going on sale in 2024 and 2025, according to the article in the paper this weekend. It's happening every.
Yeah, I would just underline that and say everyone, as we've been talking about, everyone's having these conversations. So there might be more opportunity than you think. And like I said, the earlier you start having those conversations, the better off you'll be, more options you'll be able to have about how you want to move forward. And as well, I mean, folks are connected to their community in different ways, and to different degrees. And I would encourage, if you're thinking about doing really any of these activities, sharing your space, finding a long or short-term renter, developing your property, anything like that, the more connections you have to your wider community, even your very local neighborhood, the better, because then you'll get their feedback and have their support, and be able to hear what their needs are. So if you're thinking of doing another mission-based program, your congregation might have an idea of what they think the needs are of the community, but that actually might be different than what the needs are. So it's always great to have those conversations, really low key, low stakes, just say hi to folks around the neighborhood and introduce yourself. And if you have a space to offer, or you're thinking of renting, let them know. And those things come back in dividends.
And
I
just to help,
apologize. I apologize. Whenever I'm trying to respond, it's recording the whole conversation. So I'm sorry. It's it's 1,100 being sold all over the country, not just in New York.
great, just wanted to flag that. And somebody would like to hear about how other synagogues rent spaces to nonprofits and other outside organizations. I think like a case study or an example.
Yeah, I mean, we've had other organizations who rent out space all the time. It's a matter of what they're looking for. Some could be as short term as co-op meetings, annual co-op meetings. They rent out our space for that once a year. And we have other organizations who have asked to rent out our space. Churches, for example, who've asked to use our space on Sundays, every Sunday, for services and for like activities, Sunday activities. It really depends on what they're looking for and what we're able to achieve. There have been a couple, and Kate and Karen have mentioned it during the presentation, that we've researched and decided they weren't necessarily people we wanted to rent to. And we've had to have some unfortunate and uncomfortable conversations around that. And then there were others that we made long-term contracts with. There were people who rented out our space for Christmas because they were having their sanctuaries renovated. And so we had Christmas services and Easter and other things here. And there are places like little camping and sports places for kids who use our space to be able to have birthday parties and other things. There are a myriad ways to be able to use the space. And again, it is about sort of community networking and making yourself available to people who want to ask those kind of questions and just being open.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just say, in addition to that, whether you're thinking about space sharing or anything else more broadly, one of the slides mentioned this, but staying in control, that you really are in charge of who is in your space, how you feel comfortable with them using it. That's all really up to you. And in terms of development, they're, in a high value market like New York, and probably others to experience this, developers do come knocking on your door, offering a check in their hands, saying we're the only ones that are ever going to offer you this money. But so I would also like to underline for that point too, because if you're being put in a high pressure sales situation, then you might feel like you're losing that that level of control, which is, I think, really important to maintain. It is your space, your legacy are really important for your congregation. So no matter where you are on that spectrum of just like renting out your space for one or two events and deciding how it's used, or where even in the building it's used. Maybe you don't want to use your sanctuary, or if you're thinking of a larger repurposing, then you should feel, and you are in charge of how that process goes. And don't let anyone put you in a position where you feel otherwise.
Okay. Another question is, do synagogues that bricks and mortars have worked with tend to require the same level of security requirements from their renters than their regular services or events?
I can't speak for everybody, but we do. We do. It's part of the challenge. In fact, we were just talking about that earlier before this webinar. Part of the challenge of renting space is that we're not an event venue, and we have requirements that maybe some other places don't. So if you want to rent out a space that doesn't require security, as a Jewish institution in New York, we require security. So those costs will be passed on to the people renting the space. We require a certain amount of time, a minimum for our maintenance, if our building is closed, to have them come in. And so there are certain requirements, things that you're going to have to pay for here that you may not have to pay for when you're looking at a regular venue. And it is the question of what the market will bear. And so we're very careful about those questions, and I call my local colleagues, many of whom are on this call, to ask the question about what they charge and what we're all able to, what we're all able to do. It's a good question.
Can I respond to two of the legal questions that are on there? One is the Attorney General and the other is UBIT. So the Attorney General, nonprofits get exempt from taxes because they're doing a public service. So when you sell a major asset, the government wants to make sure that you are continuing to use those proceeds for a public service. So they will look to make sure that the person who's buying the property is buying it at fair market value. They'll make sure that they are either an unrelated person, or if they're related, that it was clearly done through a fair process. They will need to approve the sale of the building. If the Attorney General is not the enemy in this case, the Attorney General is trying to make sure that the public is protected. As early as you think you are going to sell your building, you start a relationship with the Attorney General and ask to walk through that process. The New York State Attorney General has very clear guidelines on their website. That's why I put down take minutes. They're going to want to know that when you voted to sell the building, it was the right amount of people that voted. They want to go through with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that there was no fraud and that all rules have been followed and that the proceeds are going to where they're supposed to go. So connect with a lawyer early on who has a relationship with Attorney General or who can guide you through it to make sure that you don't get a surprise at the end when the Attorney General says, wait a minute, your meeting wasn't properly documented a year ago, you got to start again. In terms of UBIT, unrelated business income tax, that is a tax that a nonprofit has to pay for commercial gain, but it's a clear question of whether it's commercial or related to the mission of the organization. So I'm aware of one organization that changed its bylaws before it started renting, so that its bylaws could say that it was a more broader purposed organization. So it was to have religious services and support the community. And once it supports the community, therefore it could also rent to, again, I go back to my Boy Scouts example, or to a food pantry. But if your mission is so narrow and your mission and bylaws are so narrowly drafted, your income from a rental may be considered unrelated to your business. If your mission and vision and bylaws are broad enough, you could argue, and it's an argument, but you would say to the tax authorities, well, we're renting it to Amy's Synagogue because they're under construction, but their mission is consistent with ours, so it's part of our mission. So both of these questions are fact dependent. You need to get advice in each case. And it's a gray line in both cases as to what will be accepted and not. So think about it early, plan early. Neither of these are meant to be punitive. Both of these are both the Attorney General and the UBIT are meant to make sure that nonprofits are staying within their lanes.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or the chat.
So let me just do a final pitch for a membership in Bricks and Mortals. Temple Shari Tefillah joined, and as did I. I'm a member of the newly minted member of the board of Bricks and Mortals. And I just can't explain enough the value that they've added. I use them as a resource regularly. In fact, I think my architect is on this call as well, who introduced me to Bricks and Mortals. They're a phenomenal organization that offer a great amount of resources, not only networking opportunities where you can be introduced to a wonderful group of professionals, but just on the on the ground things that we need for our buildings in New York City as religious institutions. For example, local law 97 just came out, which requires for New York City buildings over 20,000 or 50,000 square feet, I don't remember, to change their carbon footprint. And there's all kinds of new guidelines that have come out and now things we have to comply with that basically require a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of professionals. And I went straight to Bricks and Mortals, and even in conjunction with UJA, who went right to New York City and provided webinars and guidance and help and phone numbers for people for me to call. It's really hard to get that kind of talkless help. And they provided it right front and center. And it was really, really helpful. And it's just good to know that there's partners you can call that you can really depend on. And so that's my pitch for Bricks and Mortals, because they're just amazing partners. So if you're interested, I'm happy to toot their horn if they won't do it themselves. I'm happy to do it for them.
I really appreciate that, Amy. And as I said before, our board approves the members and who all sign an ethics pledge, and then our membership elects the board. So it's really with faith-based organizations electing 2/3 of the board. So that's always faith controlled. And everything we do really is driven by what our members say and what faith-based organizations need. So the more you're involved, the more we can provide resources of any kinds that help to whatever situation you need assistance in. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to get involved, reach out to me or Amy or anyone on this call if you have any questions. And we're ending on time / early, which is great. Thank you all so much for being here again. We hope this was useful for you. Thank you so much to my other panelists and for Manor for helping us out also. Please reach out to us. Our contact information is at the end of the slide deck, which will be sent out. Thanks so much. Have a great day.